possible. They soon negotiated financing, licensing agreements, and royalties. In the midst of closing this deal with Ilan, more good news emerged. Dr. Davorit Samid, a scientist and medical professor from Maryland who Burzynski had hired to further study antineoplastons, managed to present her work at an oncology symposium in Switzerland, which landed her and antineoplastons a cover story in a 1990 issue of Oncology News.
In 1989, we retained Dr. Davorit Samid as our consultant. Dr. Samid at that time worked at Uniformed Services Medical School in Baltimore, and later she moved to the National Cancer Institute. She did a lot of work with antineoplaston ingredients. Unfortunately, when the pharmaceutical company entered the picture, such as Ilan Pharmaceutical, our consultant, Dr. Samid, became too close. She really became consultant for Ilan Pharmaceutical, and she was working with Ilan from this time.
And suddenly, Ilan Pharmaceuticals terminated their licensing agreement, stating Ilan has significant doubt as to whether the active substances comprising of antineoplastons have patent protection, thereby rendering an agreement meaningless.
Antineoplastons are not just one chemical. You have different ingredients in antineoplastons. Okay? One of these ingredients was known, and before we discovered that this is metabolite of antineoplaston, and was known and was available before. Okay, so when we patented our invention, our lawyers told us, look, you can't patent this particular ingredient because it was known before. Okay, so let's list it in your patent, but don't patent this because you never get patent for that. Okay, but this is the least important ingredient of antineoplastons.
While this was an odd turn of events, more good news continued to pour in. It was in October 1991 when Dr. Nicholas Petronas led the National Cancer Institute on their site visit, the very same site visit Dr. Petronas would later base his testimony when defending Burzynski against the Texas Medical Board. This site visit not only confirmed that antineoplastons were curing what was previously considered incurable brain cancer, but it garnered their interest in conducting a confirmatory trial under Division of Cancer Treatment sponsorship at the National Cancer Institute. These trials involved most of their top experts, including Dr. Michael Friedman, the Associate Director of the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program. In a memo addressed to his director, Dr. Friedman wrote, "I thought you would be interested in this. Antineoplastons deserve a closer look. It turns out that the agents are well-defined, pure chemical entities. The human brain tumor responses are real." The National Cancer Institute's decision network then convened and gave the green light to conduct government-sponsored clinical trials of antineoplastons.
Initially, everybody was very excited about it. Everybody would like to proceed. The people who reviewed our results, the experts from the NCI, they did a very good job. They were critical, of course, but they were also highly complimentary for the way we treat patients and the results we got. Okay, so it looks like everything should open and we move forward. Suddenly, everything came to the stop, and then we found that a few months later, Ilan received permission to do clinical trials with this particular ingredient. Okay, ours was pushed back for something like 4 years, and then Ilan was allowed to proceed with this one suddenly.
When Ilan terminated their business deal with Burzynski, they went behind his back, recruited Dr. Davorit Samid, and partnered with the National Cancer Institute, where Dr. Samid soon became a section chief. Ilan then co-sponsored laboratory research and clinical trials testing only this single ingredient, called phenylacetate, the same chemical that Burzynski was advised he couldn't patent, and had already proven to be quite limited against cancer as a single substance as far back as 1980.
After the treatment in a small number of patients, we found that the activity was quite limited. That's why we decided to abandon phenylacetate, and we use the other antineoplastons. One of them contained phenyl acetate as the second ingredient. Phenyl acetate alone has very small activity. It's not very effective.
While Burzynski was facing continuous harassment from state and federal agencies, the earliest phenylacetate studies were published in April of '92, authored by Dvorit Samid, hosted by the National Cancer Institute. Burzynski sat in awe as he witnessed the National Cancer Institute recruit one of his researchers, push his research aside, and begin to test phenylacetate without him, reporting, "Phenylacetate is both effective in inducing tumor cell maturation and free of cytotoxic and carcinogenic effects, a combination that warrants attention to its potential use in cancer intervention." The National Cancer Institute apparently pretended that they had discovered this all on their own. Burzynski's name failed to appear in the acknowledgments or any of the references listed in this report. Burzynski knew these tests would fail, since he had already proven this in his own laboratory 12 years before. Abandoned by the National Cancer Institute, he sat powerless on the sidelines as the attempted hijacking of his discovery unfolded before his eyes, ending in the hideous train wreck he warned them it would. The National Cancer Institute, Ilan, and Dr. Samid spent over 4 years and tens of millions of dollars testing phenylacetate.
The use of phenyl acetate alone was not successful, and the NCI or Ilan could not use the other ingredients of angioplastin because they were covered by the patents owned by me. They were trying to commercialize this, but without the other ingredients, they couldn't do much with this. This needed to be given in conjunction with the others.
While coming to terms with this reality, the National Cancer Institute decided to honor the government-sponsored clinical trials of anti-neoplastons they had initially promised Burzynski in 1991. From the moment this dialogue was reopened, the National Cancer Institute proposed altering the treatment protocols that Burzynski had spent 20 years perfecting. Burzynski told them that until they agree to a protocol that he has confidence in, he was not going to provide the National Cancer Institute with any anti-neoplastons. Dr. Michael Friedman told Burzynski, "In response to your correspondence, one last time, we will revise the protocol with regard to dose and schedule in compliance. However, if you are unable or unwilling to provide the anti-neoplastons in the near future, we will pursue alternative sources to procure the drug or its active components, and will proceed." Burzynski responded, "I appreciate very much that you have finally decided to follow my recommendation regarding dosage, but your final statements that you are ready to proceed with the treatment with anti-neoplastons without our participation caught me by surprise. It is hard to imagine that a federal employee would consider patent infringement." Placing these ominous threats from Michael Friedman aside, they finally managed to agree on a protocol. The protocol was simple. Patients with tumors larger than 5 centimeters, more than one tumor, or with metastasis are excluded. After everything was approved and Burzynski released his medicine, a full year passes, in which time over 15,000 Americans had been diagnosed with the types of brain cancer this trial was focusing on. Yet, America's National Cancer Institute was somehow having difficulties in accruing patients. So, they used this as an excuse to go behind Burzynski's back again and take it upon themselves to drastically alter the protocols. Dr. Friedman, it has been brought to my attention that the protocol has been amended to accept patients with tumors measuring over 5 centimeters, multiple tumors, or with metastasis. I am outraged that without my knowledge, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, with NCI's permission, changed the protocol. Treatment of patients with these conditions will require a different protocol with a different schedule and different dosages. I hereby request that the amendments be canceled immediately and the original protocol be used as promised. The National Cancer Institute responds, "Sorry, but the amendments have been approved." Burzynski fires back. "Let me make perfectly clear that as the discoverer and developer of anti-neoplastons and the individual with nearly 20 years clinical experience using them, it is my professional opinion that the drugs will not produce substantial benefit in such advanced patients. As I have repeatedly informed you, the protocol that we are currently using for such advanced tumors requires doses 3 times greater than that currently being used."
These trials have been conducted at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota and the Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York. Currently, there are only 8 patients enrolled.
I'm very dissatisfied with that because our desire is to achieve the proper enrollment in as quickly a manner as we can in order to really test this hypothesis.
Friedman blamed Burzynski for this slow motion, saying Burzynski restricted admissions to the trials too stringently. To speed things up, admission standards for the trials have been lowered to bring in patients in worse physical condition. This over Dr. Burzynski's strenuous objections.
We got the idea that the main interest is to let this patient die rapidly and make sure that treatment will never work.
Dr. Burzynski has threatened legal action to halt these new admissions, and NCI has suspended recruiting, leaving the trials with just those scientifically unsatisfactory 8 patients. Meanwhile, both the FDA and the Texas Medical Board are still trying to stop Burzynski.
On May 8th of 95, less than 2 weeks before this broadcast, the National Cancer Institute issued an internal memo to all of those involved in the anti-neoplaston trials. For the record, the Clinical Trials Monitoring Service has been instructed not to send any anti-neoplastons clinical trial data to Dr. Burzynski, the Burzynski Research Institute, or anyone inquiring about the anti-neoplastons clinical trials. Any inquiries that may be related to the trials or Dr. Burzynski are to be referred to the Associate Director, Dr. Michael Friedman. Friedman then taunts Burzynski. I must convey my deep pessimism. We are in no way obligated to obtain your consent. Your insistence on dictating the manner in which we conduct or review these clinical trials is both presumptuous and inappropriate. The future of these trials rests entirely with the NCI, since our primary obligation is to the American public. Burzynski responds, your letter of June 6 conveys pessimism. My letter conveys outrage. Patients were admitted against admission criteria, their treatment was discontinued, and their lives were jeopardized for frivolous reasons. In spite of your promise, we never received any detailed data on these patients. There must be a reason why you are afraid to provide us with complete copies of medical records. Well, there was a very good reason why Dr. Michael Friedman was afraid to provide Burzynski with complete copies of these patients' medical records.
It took us at least half a year before we forced NCI to release some of this information to us. And then we found that they severely violated protocol. They did not comply at all with the protocol. On the top of that, patients were forced to stop the treatment with antioplastons because of massive fluid retention. And this is something which we don't see with antioplastons. Typical effect of antioplastons is dehydration, which means elimination of the fluids. The patients are losing a lot of fluids to the point that they have to drink a lot of extra fluid. We don't see increased fluid retention. I was curious why this could happen. I knew that the patients were receiving a lot of intravenous fluid, but then we learned that perhaps the fluid which they were receiving were not antineoplastons.
In October of 1995, the National Cancer Institute's Cancer Information Service issued a public statement for anyone inquiring about their clinical trials of anti-neoplastons. In it, they stated, because these studies were closed prior to completion, no conclusions can be made about the effectiveness or toxicity of anti-neoplastons. To their credit, and according to the scientific standards set by the National Cancer Institute, this was indeed the truth. However, 4 years after these trials were closed, and 2 years after Burzynski defeated the FDA and won his freedom, the National Cancer Institute just couldn't leave well enough alone and decided to vindictively publish these scientifically invalid anti-neoplaston trials in the peer-reviewed medical literature. In it, they described how 9 patients were treated, and no patient demonstrated tumor regression. However, whoever was responsible for publishing this report was apparently careless enough to also include the anti-neoplastons concentrations detected in the blood of the 9 patients during treatment.
We compared this to the data which we have in our studies. We found that they were severely diluting the medicine, and this was why the patient had fluid overload. angioplaston AS2-1